Hello, this is the Digital Mass Atrocity Lab YouTube channel. We're having a Google chat today on education and war, the potential of safe schools. And we're joined with three fabulous speakers from different backgrounds that are all experts on the subject matter. And so let me introduce our three speakers today. We have Zaima Korsaneff, who's the Executive Director of the Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. We have Dia Njowan, who oversees the management of the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attacks research operations. And we have Brenda Hyplek, a Senior Education Advisor at UNICEF in New York. So thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you join us here on Google Plus via Montreal to New York. And I'd like my colleague Noah to introduce himself and give a little bit of background before we turn to the discussion.
Hi, I'm Noah Shuela. I'm a youth research fellow this summer at MIGS. And today we're going to talk about safe schools. So there's been a lot going on in the media, mostly out of conferences that have been happening in Norway. Last month there was a conference that was looking at a conference looking at safe schools. Over the past 2 days there have been a summit going on that's talking about increasing education around the world in terms of development goals. But nonetheless, this is something that a lot of people are talking about, and I think to a great extent, it's in light of the major humanitarian and human rights issue that it presents. There are currently around 65 million at-risk children between 3 and 15 years old. 37 million children are out of school in that same range. And then you have 14 million children who are either refugees or internally displaced. So what we're looking at particularly today is how do we protect schools from military use of these educational facilities in terms of barracks or for imprisonment, torture that have been used to store landmines or otherwise disruption of schools in general. So today we hope to look at issues of prevention, how do we ensure compliance, how do we react in the face of emergencies, and then how do we rehabilitate students who have suffered these sort of attacks.
So maybe to start off, just to ask the group, because the Safe Schools Initiative something that's growing, it's being covered in media in the West and across the world. But I was wondering maybe an opening question to all three of you is what is the Safe Schools Initiative for you? Give us a simple explanation according to Human Rights Watch, UNICEF, and the Global Secretariat.
Well, it's a good question because we've talked about conferences, we've talked about things happening in Oslo, but I think what Safe Schools is really about is what it means for a girl, like a girl I'll call Indira, who we met in India a few years ago, who, when we visited her school as Human Rights Watch, her school had been occupied by state paramilitary police for the last 3 years. So here was a girl struggling to go to school alongside armed men who said that when she was trying to study that it was very disturbing to her and the other children. Children described having to use the toilet in the field instead of being able to use their latrines that were taken over by the police themselves. They described being in fear of being attacked by Maoist troops who supposedly these paramilitary police were combating. This is about what makes it safe for individual children who are taking great risks to get an education even in the midst of conflict, how they can be safe, including from the very troops who should be protecting them.
Dia?
So from our perspective, the coalition focuses on a very specific issue, which is targeted attacks during conflict. And military use of school is a big risk factor for targeted attacks because under international humanitarian law, it can convert a school from a civilian object to a military object. But so when we talk about safe schools or Safe School Initiative, we're really focused on this idea of schools being safe from attack and from military use. But we're also talking broader than just schools as we think of them as, you know, schools which we go into a building with teachers and children. We think about safe learning for the whole spectrum, so from preschool but all the way up to university. And we also think of formal and informal education. And we also think about freedom to teach and freedom to conduct research and be an academic and to study what you need to study and want to study, and to be able to produce research on what you want to research. So the real wide spectrum of what school and schooling means.
Thank you. Brenda, over to you.
Yeah, from a UNICEF perspective, just to say we love working with our colleagues at Human Rights Watch with the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack, all members of that coalition, because the work we're doing is critical to helping keep children in school around the world. As you know, there are many protracted crises and new crises popping up every day, and children everywhere from Timbuktu to Afghanistan are affected on a regular basis, especially girls. And as both Dia and Zema have said, the Safe Schools Initiative is about military use, yes, but also about providing an environment for all children, girls and boys, and their teachers and other education personnel and community members to be in a place where they can actually be safe and ideally to learn. It's not just to sit in a safe space, but to actually learn while you're there, and to become a good global citizen.
Thank you so much, Brenda. One of the questions I have, and you've touched upon a bit, but why is this initiative relevant to 2015? And basically, I'd like to ask you: are we seeing an increase in patterns of attacks on schools or of students or teachers being targeted in areas where there's war or low-scale conflict?
I think that's a really good question, that now more than ever we are seeing attention being brought to the intentional targeting of schools, teachers, and students as a tactic of war, not just being caught in the crossfire. And it's nowhere more high profile than the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to Malala Yousafzai, who was shot by the Pakistani Taliban because she was not willing to stop defending girls' right to education. We've seen it in the horrific attack late last year on the army school in Pakistan, the abduction of girls in Chibok, Nigeria, who were trying to get an education. Now, just because there's more press attention doesn't mean that there's an increase in the problem. It means that it's getting more attention that it rightly deserves. But there are some terrorism databases that suggest that there is actually an increase in attacks, and it's certainly true that the Global Coalition and others have documented it as a terrible problem in wars around the world today. In Syria, we've documented in Ukraine, in South Sudan, we've seen it in Libya, in Iraq, and elsewhere. So it is certainly something that characterizes contemporary conflict and makes it incredibly urgent that countries come together now, recognizing the problem, and actually do something about it.
Thank you. Dia?
Well, in our report, Education Under Attack 2014, which was released last year, we found that there were attacks on education, schools, teachers, universities in 70 countries around the world, and there was a pattern of systematic or systemic attacks in 30 countries. And this is more than had ever been reported before, and we don't really know whether that's due to better monitoring and reporting or due to an actual increase in attacks. But we also have been conducting research on military use of schools, which, as I've said before, is a problem in problem in terms of education in itself, but also is a real risk factor for attacks on schools. And in a recent report we've just released called Lessons in War 2015, we have found that military use has occurred by government militaries as well as non-state armed groups in 26 conflicts around the world over the last 10 years, and that really is the majority of conflicts around the world. So we can really with confidence say that when a conflict in countries really anywhere in this world, military use is often, if not most commonly, a phenomenon of this.
Brenda, over to hear from UNICEF.
Yeah, in addition to what Dia said about the data that's being accumulated, from a UNICEF perspective, it's very interesting because here at the global level, I'm on email and on phone calls and visiting country teams on a regular basis. And what I've seen since I've been in New York over the past 3.5 years is an increase in at least anecdotal reporting from country teams through an education cluster mechanism, through the MRM reporting mechanism, or through just colleagues saying, hey, another attack. I recently was in Iraq on mission and met the mayor of a town that was attacked. And to see the pictures presented of that particular situation are just horrific and mind-boggling to think that children are affected by these events around the world on a regular basis. And regular, I mean every day. There's an attack coming at us, whether it be in one country or another. And this, as Diaz mentioned too, it's not just the primary schools that we hear about and focus on, but it goes all the way through to university and college level as well. On human beings, on buildings, on communities, on lives. What's interesting for the education staff working on this issue is that it's about back to learning. We can do everything else right in an emergency, in a protracted crisis. We can put up the temporary learning spaces, we can hire the teachers, provide them with cycle support training, but the social and emotional learning and the trauma and stress that children and teachers face because of these attacks or occupation are significant, and that will affect learning in the global community overall.
Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you. So it was mentioned that we see this in 70 countries, but most systematically in 30 countries. From my research, I've seen that a few countries there is a real centralization of these attacks. Which countries specifically do you believe require safe schools in a way? Is there any pattern, or are they sort of individual cases? Zama, maybe you can start.
I mean, it's different from one country to the next, but some of the countries where we've seen the largest number of cases include countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, but there are also countries where maybe they haven't experienced attacks numbering in the thousands like some of those countries, but where there have been very serious incidents that have maimed or killed a lot of people, whether it's attacks in Somalia. We're certainly seeing a lot of attacks being reported in South Sudan. But that's one of the reasons why research on this topic is so important, is to know what is being targeted and why, because unless we know the answers to those questions, we can't do what we need to do to prevent attacks from occurring. Is it because insurgents don't like what's being taught in the school? Is it being seen as an imposition of another culture? Is there an objection to educating girls? Is it boys' schools that are being attacked? Is this simply a soft symbol of government that it's easier to attack a school than a well-defended military installation? The answers to those questions vary from place to place, and we won't have solutions unless we answer them. But one thing that has really stuck out that Dia and Brenda have mentioned is the practice of using schools for military purposes. And we find that when troops move into a school, which they may like because it has a roof over their heads, it has latrines, they may feel entitled to use a government facility. When they move in, not only do they create a wholly inappropriate environment for children's education, they actually turn the school into a target. And that's why the coalition is working so hard, working closely with others to try to get countries to agree to avoid using schools for military purposes whenever possible. The schools are often used as a first resort for militaries, and they should be avoided in most cases.
Thank you. Dia?
And following up on Zama's point, we hear about just the horrific attacks where people are killed and buildings are destroyed and so forth, but the impact on the lives of children and whole communities from military use is perhaps not as dramatic in terms of what you see on TV, but thousands and thousands are impacted because when the military comes in, what happens is there's an immediate exodus of students from the school. So sometimes the school is shut down entirely because the military takes it over and the kids have to go somewhere else. Sometimes they continue to have to be educated in the same buildings and in the same classrooms with soldiers, outside training in their playground. But either way, the numbers, for example, in India in 2010, I think it was about 20,800 students who are impacted by this military use of schools. And the same is true in other countries where this takes place. So it's thousands and thousands of children, and this, of course, has ramifications in terms of their ability to contribute to society moving forward if their education has been so compromised. So,
Brenda?
I think it's important that we noted that the number of attacks, both documented and undocumented, are increasing around the world. But we also have to remember that every attack, even if it's one school, in between a school and a child's home, is still alive or lives change. So every single attack not just the numbers of attacks themselves matter. And that the narratives we're starting to collect, especially through the informal mechanisms of how these attacks or occupations are changing people's lives, both from students through teachers to community members, is staggering. What we also know from evidence is that when schools are closed or occupied, children miss out on learning, and every day they miss out on is a day lost. It's very, very hard to catch up. So as Dia said, by children not going to school, economic development of a country, of a community is affected well beyond just the few days or weeks or months or years that school is occupied.
And if I could just come in again and focus also on the fear factor, right? It's not just what actually takes place, but it's the pervasive sense of fear that's a result of an attack taking place that just causes parents to keep their children at home, particularly girls, because they're worried about what will happen on the way to school or at school, and so you've got it's a real multiplier effect in terms of what the impact is.
Just to add on to that as well, if you have schools that are occupied but partially still working, you have the interactions between students and militaries or occupying forces as well, which can wreak havoc or have detrimental effects to community members, especially children.
Thank you. As we mentioned, as Noah mentioned, last month Norway hosted the Oslo Conference on Safe Schools and called upon many different countries to sign the Global Coalition's design guidelines. I was wondering if you could speak in your own words, personal or organizational, but how important are initiatives like this in attaining real change?
Well, to me, this is incredibly important, and it's very rare, I think, in this field where a problem is identified, and in a relatively short period of time, countries come together in what is now a state-led process to do something about it. I mean, if you ask an ordinary person, would you like to have troops stationed inside your child's school? The answer is obviously not. But in fact, most countries around the world don't have any restrictions on their military's ability to use schools for military purposes. So in the last month and a half, now some 47 countries have come together to endorse what's called the Safe Schools Declaration, which commits to guidelines on protecting schools and universities from military use, which is just a clear set of 6 guidelines designed to provide guidance to troops in the field about how to avoid using schools for military purposes. I mean, my hope with this initiative is that we will start seeing children who previously were either not in school because troops were using their schools, or who were struggling to go to school alongside armed men, children who will now be able to study in safety and without fear. It's a wonderful initiative, and one that more countries now need to get behind.
Yeah.
I think also just the fact that a few years ago this wasn't something that people were talking about, it wasn't something that was really well known. It's not to say it wasn't happening, it was just that it wasn't even defined as an issue, and now the UN Security Council has taken this on full blown, and they've, in resolution 2143, they've stated that countries need to take concrete measures to address this issue of military use, and so we've been able to see that, but by separate from even the Safe Schools Declaration or the guidelines or anything, just the recognition of this as a problem that people need to do something about, I think has really been a huge step forward. And then being able to take it to a place where countries are actually making a commitment to take action is pretty phenomenal, as Emma said, in the short time period. But I would also say broader than the guidelines, the Safe School Declaration also includes a number of commitments to look at protecting education more generally from attack within conflict zones, and the type of things that countries have made political commitments to, strengthening monitoring and reporting, taking action against perpetrators, providing support to victims, even looking at things like the curriculum and ensuring that programs are implemented that are conflict sensitive so that they're not triggers for violence in the future. These are really important steps forward, I think, and yeah. And also just the coordination between the NGO community, the UN, and states all coming together to promote these ideas and to think of ways to deal with it is also quite unique.
Thank you. Brenda? Oh.
Just to say, if people listening to this hangout are curious about whether their own country or the country where they're working has joined the declaration, they can go to the coalition's website, protectingeducation.org, and look up and see if their country is on that list of 47, and if not, start asking why not and what they can do about it.
Yeah, my country, Canada, has not signed it yet, but I wrote an op-ed with Noah trying to put pressure, so hopefully we'll be able to add Canada to that list. Brenda, would you like to add in on this question?
Yeah, I think what's interesting from an education sector perspective is this advocacy work at all levels, global, regional, national, has been very time and labor intensive, but what it's done is it's raised colleagues' thinking across organizations within UNICEF, UNESCO, INGOs, NGOs, governments around the world to say, hey, something's being done about this. We have to work on a framework together. And I think by working together, literally hand in hand at global, regional, country level, that's going to make a huge difference. And with this declaration, with so many member states signing on, that will also push governments to take this quite seriously. And the end result will be, hopefully, all children everywhere in safe school environments learning.
Thank you. I think we're going to have one more general question to all panelists, and then we're starting to get some questions coming in via Twitter or Facebook. So we'll pose those to you. But did you want to ask Noah the last general question?
Yeah. So we discussed that now there's a lot of pressure going on governments to back these initiatives, but the United Nations Special Envoy for Global Education, Gordon Brown, has recently been proposing that attacks on schools should be considered a crime against humanity. I wanted to get your thoughts on this, whether you agree or disagree, and see how this might change the way in which countries sort of approach this problem.
Yeah. Well, just to clarify, I mean, attacking a school that is not being used to fight the war, that's not being used for military objectives, is already a violation of the laws of the war. What the coalition is seeking to clarify, to provide more specificity for countries, is when schools can be used for military purposes, right? Because when the school is taken over, it's no longer a civilian building, it can legally be attacked. But in fact, using schools for military purposes with students there actually puts their lives at risk, it can endanger their access to education, and constitute a violation of countries' human rights obligations. And what the guidelines do is really clarify how you need to look at the protections and the laws of war and human rights and understand the ongoing obligations of militaries not to use schools for military purposes and therefore endanger children's and teachers' safety and lives, but also their right to education. But there should be no mistake that when a school is not being used, it is a protected civilian object, and attacking it would violate the laws of war.
Yeah.
Well, I think Zema has said all there is to say on that point. Yeah, the guidelines are there to sort of clarify and to make it easier to better protect schools and education in times of conflict. And sometimes the law is there; it's actually the implementation that's a problem. And so I think that's where more focus needs to be at the moment.
Brenda, would you like to add anything to this point?
Yeah, I think having the framework now in place with the guidelines is a huge step in the right direction. Collecting the data that we've all talked about and rigorously analyzing that data and sharing it as widely as possible to understand why attacks are occurring, where, etc. But also to remember that schools are supposed to be around the world safe places for children, for teachers, for community members. If we can't do that as a global society, then what are we all about as human beings? I also hope what we can learn from this is that perhaps what we're learning can be applied to other sectors like health. Attacks on health facilities, perhaps a guideline system for sectoral systems and mechanisms across sectors. I think that would be quite brilliant if we can learn from this experience.
Wonderful. So we have a couple of questions coming in from online. Question one, it's not directed at any of the panel members, so once again, if you'd like to respond to it, feel free. But the question comes from Megan, who asks, do you think that the United Nations monitoring and reporting mechanism can be a helpful tool in prosecution and prevention of attacks on schools?
Well, I'm really glad Megan asked that question because the answer is yes, it can. The UN monitoring reporting mechanism on children in armed conflict, for people who are not familiar with it, is one of the stronger mechanisms in the United Nations to hold parties accountable for committing grave violations against children in war. And one of those grave violations is attacking schools and hospitals and the teachers and medical personnel around those. The UN Security Council has also been requesting more information and monitoring of the military use of schools. And I assume Megan is asking this question because she's familiar with the monitoring reporting mechanism, but there's a new handbook that's been put out by the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children in Armed Conflict. And it includes not only the guidelines, but also more information about how the UN country teams that are supposed to do this monitoring can actually take up the issue of military use with troops in the field who they are encountering using schools. It gives them more tools in their toolbox to actually tell troops you shouldn't be using schools.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I think it not only can be, but it has already been very useful in terms of protecting education during conflict. Again, part of it is just by having it as one of the trigger mechanisms. It forces countries to have to develop, countries that have been found to be perpetrators of attacks and other of the grave violations, to have to develop action plans where they actually have to show what they're doing to protect against these attacks. And that's a very strong motivation for first aid to take action against it. So I think we can already see that there's been progress made because it's become a trigger mechanism.
Yeah.
Thank you. Brenda?
I think collecting this evidence in a rigorous way is critical to moving this agenda and the issue forward at all levels. Also, I wanted to note that UNICEF is working with the Global Cluster to provide a training or guidelines on the MRM, because as you know, cluster members, organizations working at country level, have an intimate knowledge of education sector work, of schools, of systems, etc., and contacts in those systems. So to support the MRM collection of data, we have to figure out how we can be innovative and use colleagues and systems on the ground that already exist to verify data, to add additional data, etc., all within the MRM framework.
Maybe just to add, because the education cluster has done such important work on this topic, is that it's folks with the education cluster in, for example, South Sudan, who have been the ones to say to put a price tag on military use of schools, and they estimate that it costs over $60,000 US to rehabilitate a school in South Sudan that's been used by troops. And I think that that very tangible, firsthand field experience of saying, international donors to education are not going to give money once; they're going to have to give money twice. First to build the school, and then to rehabilitate it after troops come in. That data is so important and so compelling.
Just to add, Zema, to what you've said, that's critical because we know that the funding gap for education in emergencies, particularly in crisis situations, is critical. Education emergencies gets less than 2% of humanitarian funding. And if we know that our investment is going to be destroyed or lost because of occupation or an attack, then how do we support better investment and investment lasting longer?
Okay. I know, Nicola, we have a question that's coming from online. We want to...
Yeah, our colleague Nicola is actually tweeting live along with us, and he has a question about Nigeria. So we know that Boko Haram has perpetrated many attacks on schools, and that they actually target schools specifically. Shekau has been quoted saying that teachers who teach Western education, we will kill them. How has the now attention on protecting safe schools changed things in Nigeria? Is there more of an impetus to protect schools? Has it changed the reality at all? Does anyone want to answer that question?
Who wants to take the first bite?
I can. Oh, same. Okay.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, in Nigeria, UNICEF is working with the government and other partners on the National Safe Schools Initiative to ensure schools are safe zones for learning. And measures in that work include ensuring the physical protection of schools, better early warning systems in the event of attacks. UNICEF has also partnered with DFID in the UK to support the enrollment of an additional 1 million girls. As we know, girls are affected in different ways, and perhaps more severely than boys in many locations around the world. So how do we decrease barriers to girls going back into these difficult learning environments?
Yeah, and just to add, I mean, one of the things, in addition to protecting students from attacks by Boko Haram, is the role of the Nigerian government. And the Nigerian government has actually been quite a vocal supporter of the Safe Schools guidelines, and by making that commitment now, very much has the obligation to ensure that its troops do not use schools for military purposes and to address human rights violations by its own troops as well in responding to these horrific attacks.
Great.
Dia?
I would just say that I think the situation in Nigeria has also sort of highlighted the difficulty in terms of how to respond when you've got such a security concern. Either there's sort of the immediate responses to arm teachers, to build up walls, to really militarize the response. And research in other places has shown that often has the exact opposite impact, and can, for example, having security guards accompany teachers to schools in Thailand has resulted in the people accompanying them actually being targeted for attack because they're seen to represent the government, and so this puts the teachers at even more risk instead of protecting them. So the need to sort of fight against that automatic reaction to just focus on increasing security is something that countries like Nigeria and Pakistan and other places are really having to grapple with. And this is why we so desperately need to sort of think about what is really effective in these types of circumstances, what works and what might actually do more harm. And that really varies depending upon the context of the country, and there's no one-size-fits-all that you can apply everywhere. But that's another part of the work that we're trying to do, is really trying to document measures that are effective in different places so that other countries can learn from the experiences of others and how they can sort of, adapt it to their own context to see if it would work there.
I think that's a very interesting point. We tend to focus on how to increase security at schools. We've noticed that in Pakistan, some teachers are now carrying weapons. But I'm wondering, what are some of the non-security measures that can be put in place to make a school safer? Is it having an early warning system of armed factions in the area? Is it designing buildings architecturally in a different manner that would allow students to be safer if there was an attack? What are some of the lessons out there that we're starting to see that might be that might help us move in that direction?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's all of those things, right? There's not going to be one thing that you can do in every place, and there's not even going to be just one thing you do in one place. You're going to have a whole range of measures that come from the ministry, to the military, to the community level as well. And so in Palestine, for example, they've developed text message systems where if they know there's some sort of a risk on one route, the parents text message each other and teachers so that they take another route to go to school, for example. They have, in some countries, Afghanistan particularly, they've developed community schools because often schools are attacked because they're associated with the state. So sort of taking them away from that state association and putting them within the community where they're sort of more hidden has been one way of protecting schools as well. But I think probably Brenda has a lot more examples working specifically in the education field, right, on the ground.
Yeah. One thing that's important, Dia, that you noted, there's no one-size-fits-all. So what the GCPA is doing with coalition members is documenting best practices, lessons learned from around the world. And I think that's critical because it helps people realize, one, they're not alone, that these attacks and occupation situations are happening not just in one country but in many locations, and that gives people a bit of energy to keep going, because this is probably one of the most complex issues that we're currently dealing with, in my opinion, in education. I also think, as Dia said, that this community-based schools idea is quite innovative, and we've seen in Afghanistan, as she said, in Sri Lanka, in many contexts. The idea of home-based learning modules or student-to-student learning, where you have older students working with younger students, virtual curriculums. Many students now across the world have laptops or some kind of technology, even a phone, where they can use that type of mechanism to learn. So I think as long as we keep being creative and sharing what we're learning, so we're not reinventing the wheel across countries, that's going to make a huge difference. And I think one of the important roles of the coalition is to assemble all of this information on what's working and where, and how countries and communities have got things up to scale. Sharing that is going to make a huge difference.
Thank you. We have a question coming in from online. Noah, do you want to read it? It touches a bit upon what you mentioned, Brenda, but I think we should read it out and have other people's feedback.
Sure. So the question is, can you imagine a technological tool that could be used in conflict zones to protect schools? Zayma, maybe do you want to start with this one?
Well, I think this is a good question for UNICEF, actually, when it comes to that really specific sort of programmatic intervention. I'd love to hear what UNICEF and education specialists are doing.
Okay.
Thanks,
Back to you.
So I think just the old-fashioned, word of mouth, what's happening, as Dia said, communities warning each other by using a phone. We know this is not attacks related, but in the context of Uganda, using cell phones to collect information on teacher absenteeism, schools being closed due to whatever issue, that has been a very, very powerful way of collecting data. So using cell phones, using human beings to convey information. I think the area of innovation is quite open. I think the possibilities that haven't been discovered yet are out there. And because we have all this momentum now and many member states on board, hopefully that will generate more interest and the creative people out there to help us come outside of our box to figure out how to use technology to better understand what's happening on the ground.
Over to you, Dia. Would you like to add to that?
Yes. So some of the things so one obvious one is this virtual learning, right? If children, there are places and areas of Nigeria would be one of these places where it just is not safe yet for students to go back to schools, and some of our members really stress this point that the right to education is very important, but the right to life is also important, and so we shouldn't be trying to push children back to school if we can't guarantee their safety within those schools. So any type of technology which enables students to learn within their homes is going to be critical and very important. And also, I think this has been done more at the university level than at the school level at present, but that sort of virtual learning is something that we need to develop much more in depth. But also technology is being used for the monitoring and reporting of attacks, and I've heard this in terms of attacks on health workers, where mobile phones are used to document attacks on hospitals and attacks on medical workers, and then that data can be gathered, because of course it's so difficult to get information about where, what the incidents of attacks are in the places where they're happening the most, in places which are deep in conflict, which the media doesn't get out to. And so if people in those places themselves can provide some of that information, it could take us a long way further in terms of being able to understand what's happening, and then of course be able to do something about it. So.
Yeah. And just to say, too, we've now talked a lot about two really important areas, which are monitoring and reporting and the sort of very practical response at the field level. But the third component, which is holding to account those who are responsible for attacking schools, teachers, and students, is another equally important pillar. It's not something that can be solved by an individual student with an app. It's something that requires real political will, strong and forensic investigations, and a sense of prioritization that that attackers will be prosecuted in countries where there's the capacity to do so, or taken to regional or even international levels where they can be held to account. I mean, there's in some ways there's only so much education service providers can do without serious accountability for those who are responsible. And the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over intentional attacks on education institutions. It hasn't yet been part of the charges that they have brought, but it is something that attackers of schools should fear and bear in mind when they're attacking a school.
I have a question that I'm not sure if either of you can answer, but we're a university-based research center focusing on human rights. I'm wondering, what do you see the best role for groups like ours in helping deal with this problem? Is it synthesizing information? Is it trying to develop programs that could allow citizen-based reporting from areas where this is happening? Is it doing on-the-ground interviews with people to try to really determine what's happening? What would you see would be the greatest contribution of academics and others to advance your work?
I mean, just to jump in, I think there's so many questions where there's so much more research that's needed, whether it's in individual country situations, looking more deeply at why attacks are occurring, and using that information, not just sort of at the academic exercise, but to devise strategies that work in response, to really drilling down and being able to evaluate what's working in one country and why, and how that can be replicated someplace else to be more effective. And the coalition has both tried to compile what's being tried and to go into more depth around teacher protection on community-based measures, and to share that across from, whether it's the Philippines or Nepal or Thailand or India or Afghanistan, sharing that information across countries. But there's so much more deep research that's desperately needed, and I would love to see universities take that up.
Dia, would you like to give us some tips of how we could help in this important global human rights issue?
Well, I would also say that the universities are so critically placed because organizations that are actually providing support on the ground, they have all sorts of concerns where they have to be careful what they say, and they've got to work with the governments, they've got to work in those actual areas, so the universities can come in there really as a neutral party and capture some of that information that the other organizations can't do. So it's absolutely critical that that they play a role. The other part, I think, is also the student population. So the mobilization of students, but also the professors and the teaching staff. And in some of the work that we've done, we also work on higher education issues, and we've developed a set of principles of state responsibility to protect higher education from attack. Where we're looking at partnering with the higher education communities to really identify what responsibility states have to on one hand respect the autonomy of the university, but at the same time provide the type of support that's needed to ensure that that environment is safe. So two things: there's all the research that you can do that Zane is talking about, but there's also the advocacy that you can do being members of this community.
Brenda?
Yeah, I think evidence and the role of the university and the academy in this is critical. I personally would like to see a mixed methods approach, so you've got the quantitative data of attacks and occupation mixed with the narratives from a qualitative perspective of the people affected, from the Ministry of Education officials, how that affects children at school level and everybody in between. And then what would be extremely powerful in terms of very evidence that would help us to supplement what we know. We know that, as I mentioned, every day that a child is out of school, it's very hard to capture that lost time and to relearn what they've missed. We also know from evidence around the world in many different contexts that being in school is a very effective way to help children heal from a war, from any kind of emergency setting or crisis that they've been through. The longer schools are closed, for whatever reason, the harder it is for children to go back to a normal setting. So if the research community can link attacks and occupations of education systems and locations to lost time and the economic impact of what that does to individual students and how that literally could destroy a personal life or a family, that would be extremely valuable evidence and would help us advocate at all levels to move this and address this issue at the highest level.
Well, thank you very much. We're almost out of time. It's amazing how fast time flies when we're discussing such important issues as this. I'm wondering, in closing, the great thing about doing these Google Plus Hangouts is that it creates a digital content that we share online, that we share via Twitter. We plan on tweeting this discussion to different foreign ministers and heads of states to raise awareness and have them think about it. But I was wondering if there's one last message, very simple, that each one of you would like to just finalize this talk with? What is the main message that you think that people that watch this discussion should leave with?
For me, it's really that this is a really critical moment. After growing body of research both on the problem of attacks on schools and the role that military use of schools plays in it, countries are coming together. We have 47 countries who've joined the Safe Schools Declaration. The deadline to be one of the founding group of states is the 31st of July, and states are in danger of being left behind. So I hope people who are watching this will both look and see if their own countries have become a part of it, press them if they haven't, and know that this is an area where there are going to be real changes, I hope, that will make a difference for children, and this is the moment where states need to join the declaration and get on board.
Thank you. Dia?
And I would say as well that even for the states that have joined the declaration, it's also, there needs to be implementation. So we also need to go beyond just the rhetoric of, making an announcement that we're joining onto a declaration, and actually to take action to implement what's included in that declaration. And then as I was saying earlier, there are many different things, sort of a holistic approach to addressing protection of education in conflict zones, and so states can take sort of a variety of different approaches towards it, but to really focus on the action aspect of it.
Brenda, you have the last word.
All children, girls and boys, in safe, protective schools, learning. Let's work together.
I hear people clapping from across the room with us. So on behalf of my colleagues at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies and the Digital Mass Atrocity Prevention Lab, we want to thank all three of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us and share your expertise. This is an issue that education in war and the potential of safe schools is something I think that more governments need to support and implement important measures and work and listen to what the Global Coalition, Human Rights Watch, and UNICEF is advocating for. And we hope to stay in touch, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Have a great afternoon.